And hello once again, my name is Lupus, and today we're going to be looking at speech act theory in practice. So first I should say, this is basically a companion piece to the previous video. I will not be explaining what speech act theory is, because there was an entire video that was about that. So if you want to know what speech act theory is, you should go and check out that video first, before coming back here. Now, before we go into the content of the video, let's just say that if you appreciate these videos that I make, and I've made so many of them, and you want to support some of the stuff that I do, you can check out my books, or you can become a patron on Patreon. But we're going to move on from that for now. We'll talk about that a bit later. Let's talk about speech act theory in practice. So, speech act theory, how can it be used? So, just as a extremely, very super quick recap, a speech act is a form of speech that leads to an act. That is all I will say. There is that whole video that I've mentioned that you can check out to sort of actually go into the specific details. So, how can some of these specific examples and issues be parts of speech act theory in practice? So, firstly, the declarations of human rights. In various countries, there are declarations of human rights. You know, probably the most famous is like the Declaration of Human Rights by the UN. And basically, the reason that this is a speech act is because through language, these things have been declared. Basically, you've said, every human has a right to life, has a right to education, has a right to this, has a right to that. All the different human rights that have been stated. However, human rights are not actually immutable things that are bestowed onto us by God or something. They are determined by people who have tried to figure out the best way to live in an egalitarian society. Basically, humans have tried to figure out how they can live in a society in which everyone is equal. So, how do you do that? Well, you have human rights. Now, obviously, there are many issues with human rights as an ethical model, but I'm not going to be getting into that. But if you do want to know about that, I have a bunch of videos about different ethical models and deontology as human rights. So, if you want to learn more about that, you can look up my video about deontological rights. So, let's move on. But basically, the human rights, or the Declaration of Human Rights, are statements, right? Every human has a right to life. By saying that, by having it written out in an official capacity, right, through language, it is then stating that this is a truth. This is basically something that is going to be deemed correct, right? It is going to be deemed correct and accepted by the people who essentially sign and agree to the Declaration of Human Rights. So if people agree to it, which, say for instance, in a country, if you live in a country that has a Declaration of Human Rights, which most countries that have access to YouTube do, I can only speak definitively on behalf of South Africa, which is my country, and here we very much do have a Bill of Human Rights, and basically, in that Bill of Rights, it says all the different things, and because we live in the society, you implicitly agree to them. You don't actually sign anything, but by being a citizen, you are essentially agreeing to conform to those rules and those laws which determine human rights for people. So, that is basically how it works. If you break those human rights, you can be subject to penalty. Those penalties will often be things like jail time. For instance, the right to life means that you should be allowed to live without someone stopping that life before it naturally ends. Essentially, no one can kill you. That's like the most basic human right that there is. So, if someone does murder you, well, they will receive a penalty for that. Penalty usually being prison time. They go to prison. Okay, so, you know, that is why it is a speech act. Because it has been declared, and then if anybody breaks that declaration, if they go against what the speech act is, they get punished. Okay, the next thing here is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This is brought up a lot in the study guide, from which a lot of this information comes from. But for those who don't know what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is, there's actually more than one now, because South Africa was the model that basically created it, but I know there was a Canadian one as well. Basically, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is the idea that people come to this commission and give the truth. They tell the truth without fear of negative repercussions from, you know, say, lawful repercussions. So in South Africa, in the history of apartheid, in the aftermath of that, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, was set up for people who perpetrated acts in the name of apartheid, and also actually people who were affected negatively by apartheid. They both came together to each essentially give their stories, to tell their stories, to tell their truth. And all of that was then put together. And essentially all the people who came forward were, well, most, not all. There were some people who was deemed as basically above the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in some sense. People like, I can't remember his name, the Prime Evil. He ran Flakplas. Basically, he was in prison. He was only recently released, but that's only because he's old. So basically, most people didn't get punished like he did, but he was also very much in charge of things. But most people, the people who did bad things, by coming forward to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and telling their story, they were basically, they received reconciliation. They received, they were not punished. They were rather pardoned of what they had done under a fascist regime that came before, the apartheid government, which was fascist. So basically they came in and they tell their story, and then they would not be criminally prosecuted for what they did, such as, say for instance, cops that, either murdered or beat or whatever people of color. Like that would be those kind of people, but the regular run-of-the-mill cop, not the people in charge. So, because otherwise you'd be putting millions of people in prison, which would be a very difficult logistical nightmare. So, basically, by going to the TRC and telling your story, by putting that story out there, by doing that, you are then pardoned for what has been done. So, by giving your story, you are essentially performing the act of giving the truth, of giving people closure. Because, for instance, there are so many, because you can read the TRC logs, they're completely free, you can read them all. A lot of them are also from people who obviously negatively affected the people who were actually affected by those who did bad things. Because so many people were disappeared, people were kidnapped, killed, all that kind of stuff in the name of the apartheid government. And those people came forward to tell their stories about how their loved ones were taken from them, disappeared in the night, things like that. And basically, for these other cops to come forward and be like, we were the ones who took your child or your father or your whoever, it does give a sense of closure. Now, obviously, not everybody is happy with this kind of system, because essentially the perpetrators of acts are being pardoned for what they did. But on such a mass scale, it can be seen as necessary. To certain people, obviously, it being necessary is a value judgment. So you might not agree with it, but it was deemed as necessary. So, but by going to the TRC, right, by giving this, your testimony, by telling your things, the judge would pardon you for your act. So, you see, it is a form of speech act in the sense, because you are giving up this information, you're putting it into the world, you're making it real, and then the speech act of the judges and what have you, by saying things like, you are now pardoned, they are, essentially, through language, determining that you are not liable. You're not going to be held liable for whatever those things were. The next thing, which is kind of related, is hate speech and injurious language. Injurious language is obviously language that causes injury. Not necessarily physical injury. It's not like someone screamed at you so loudly that your ears burst, but literally hate speech. People using slurs and what have you. In America, it could be like the N-word. In South Africa, it would be the K-word. Or whatever other slurs there happen to be for various groups. There are slurs for basically every minority. I say basically, but there's slurs for every minority. I suppose there's also slurs for majorities, but they're not usually affected negatively by those. They are, strictly speaking, I suppose, slurs for white people, but it's not like they have a history of being used to denigrate and repress people, so they don't really have any power really behind them. But the idea of speech act theory, now this is a thing that Judith Butler spoke about, is that hate speech, right, is actually a speech act. Because by using, say, a slur on someone, by calling, a minority a slur word, whatever that minority happens to be and whatever that word happens to be, you are putting into the world that they are less. A slur is a way of determining that somebody else is below you. So if you're white, and you use the K word in South Africa, the N word isn't really a thing in South Africa, but say in America, the N word is a thing. So you could substitute those two, the K word in South Africa, the N word in America. if you say, as a white person, if you say that word to a black person, by saying the word and knowing its racial history and knowing how it has been used, because you know how it's been used, because that's why you're using that word, if you're a racist, you are, through your language, saying and basically making somebody else less than you. You are saying that they are less than you. So that is an act that moves through language. And this kind of relates to the next one, which is incitement to violence. If you incite people to violence, if you say things to get people to want to hurt others, you are performing an act. But it's a very good cover for like a lot of politicians, right? A politician incites people to violence through hate speech a lot of the time, right? They'll incite people to violence, but I didn't do anything. I didn't kill anyone. I didn't do it. So you could actually say in the most famous example, pretty much, you could say, well, strictly speaking, Adolf Hitler never killed anyone himself. Well, actually, I suppose he was a soldier, but like he didn't kill one of the races he hated himself. Why would you do that? He's a politician. He incited other people to do it for him, basically. He didn't kill anyone. He never killed anyone. And it's a very good cover to use that racists will use, like racist leaders. The people, so when you look at people like, the heads of like white supremacist organizations, they don't do any of these acts themselves. They've never attacked a minority, but they did tell other people to attack a minority. And you could say, oh, they didn't definitively say that. They didn't say, I want you to go and attack this person. But by using the kind of racist rhetoric, they incited other people to violence. So they were, through their language, acting. They were putting out into the world that something must be done about this bad race. That is what they're essentially doing. So, those are all different speech act things. Now, the next one is discursive resignification, which is a big fancy word for resignification. Basically means recreating the meaning of something through language. So, essentially, something means something at one point, but then you can reclaim it and do something else with it, which there's all sorts of ways you could look at discursive resignification. Take a word like gay, I suppose, could be a thing like this. Gay was a word to mean happy, and then it became resignified as being as meaning homosexual. So resignification, you can resignify what it is through language, but that is also then literally changing what it means and how it is used in the world in a very definitive way. Now, the next one I did briefly mention a couple of times in my previous video about speech act theory, which is gender ascriptions and bodily acts. Now, this is where you get into the realm of Judith Butler. And Judith Butler, when they looked at basically speech act theory, they took the ideas of speech act theory that you can do something through language that then enacts an act, and essentially moved it into also the realm of bodily acts, doing things to then basically do something else. So when it comes to gender ascriptions, when it comes to something like pronouns, this is a thing you'll see a lot of time nowadays, the idea of respecting people's pronouns. By respecting someone's pronouns or disrespecting someone's pronouns, you are ascribing a certain gender onto them. You are performing a speech act. Now, if you respect someone's pronouns, you are basically affirming their identity for them and to them. Whereas if you are not, it's hate speech. It is basically hate speech by not respecting a pronoun. You are doing hate speech. You are using speech to enact an act on someone to make them less than what they are. You are saying that they are not what they identify as. And then bodily acts will be things, this is why it becomes a little bit hazy here, where there's a lot of criticism of bodily acts being seen as a speech act. It was definitely inspired by speech act theory, but is it still speech act theory? So maybe you could call it bodily act theory, but it's inspired by it and it has a lot of influence from it. So essentially bodily acts are gender signifiers that you can do, well, not necessarily gender, but gender is a good way to see it. It can be anything bodily, but do things that ascribe what it means to be a certain gender. So imagine, we always talk about this in terms of transgender people. That's how a lot of people talk about it. But let's talk about cisgender people in this sense. Okay, you're a man. You're a cisgender man. You're a heterosexual man. Okay, cool. That's all fine. How do you perform a bodily act that affirms your gender. Oh, well, simple. Maybe you could go and try and get big muscles. Maybe you could speak in a more like deep voice and have a confident facade that you put on. Maybe you could do that, which is something that you're putting on. It's a performance that you are putting on. It's a, that is also like a bodily act. You could change your tone, right? You could do these things to put these things on. You could sort of say, okay, well, I have to have a certain kind of haircut, a more masculine haircut. I can't have, say, long hair, because then that becomes more feminine. I have to have, like, a buzz cut, which then ascribes that kind of gender. Or I have to wear the kind of clothes that are most flattering to a male physique, right? If I have a bit more muscles, I need to have, like, a vest, because I need to show off my muscles. Look at how manly I am. Look at how big I am. These are bodily acts that you're then enacting. Or you could say for cisgender woman, right? You could say, well, the things that if you wanted to see more feminine, more womanly, you might do things like wearing makeup. You might wear certain types of clothes that are more form-fitting. You might walk in a certain way. A person's gait is actually very, very important, the way they walk. There is a way that is seen as masculine walking and feminine walking, but that's a bodily act. A man can walk in a womanly way, and a woman can walk in a manly way, because that is actually just a nonsense thing that's been ascribed by society onto what it means to be a woman. It is not determined by biology, it is determined by society. So bodily acts are these things which are things that you are doing to perform gender. And also, if you hear the term perform gender and you're offended because you don't know what those words mean, I would recommend Google. Gender performance is not saying that gender is just like something you put on. That's not what gender performance is, but I'm not going to go into it here. There are so many people who've talked about gender performance, but that is essentially what bodily acts are. It's performance of things to do with your body, to do with your identity. Now, the next thing I'm going to talk about here is the problem of intention and accountability in speech act theory. If you say a speech act, which then leads to an action, are you accountable for it? Or what was your intention? So, say for instance, hate speech. What if you didn't know it was a slur? For instance, there is a word for Romani people. I'm not going to say the word, but there is a word that is used for Romani people, which a lot of people, for instance, like in my country, a lot of people don't even know that it's a slur. It's a slur in Europe because they use that particular word to attack that particular racial group. At in South Africa, a lot of people I've met, well, first off, there's not really a history of the Roma in South Africa. I'm sure there is, but not to my knowledge, at least not a history that's deeply bound into the culture of South Africa that I'm aware of. Obviously, I could be extremely wrong, but not that I know of. Usually when people use that word here, they mean someone that moves around a lot. And also, there is literally a chain of shops in this country that has that word. So there's literally a chain of shops in this country, and the name of the shop is a slur. But people don't see it that way in this country because we don't really have that history of it. So if you use that word, you are enacting hate speech, but you didn't know that. So does that mean that you are still accountable for what you did? Now here's also what you can say. If you say a slur, but you don't know it's a slur, and someone corrects you, now you know it is a slur. What you do next actually means a lot. Do you continue to use that slur, or now because you've been told that it's a slur, do you stop using it? If you keep using it, you know it's a slur. So maybe stop. But if you do keep using it, then all of a sudden the intention does shift a bit, doesn't it? Because if someone genuinely doesn't know that something is offensive, you can't really be angry at them unless they refuse to change their behavior. Let's say, for instance, right, if you were to misgender someone, and then they corrected you, and you said, oh, I'm so sorry, and then you use the correct gender. You use the correct pronoun. If you do that, you're being respectful, right? If you then afterwards keep misgendering them, now you can't say, oh, it's because you made a mistake or whatever. You're doing it on purpose. So it really does depend on all of this. So speech act theory can be difficult when it comes to intention and accountability. Now, the very last thing I'm going to talk about here in terms of speech act theory and practice is literature as a speech act. Right, so is literature a speech act? By making a book, is that also putting something into the world? Yes, but how far are you willing to go with speech act theory? And I actually spoke about that in the last one, where if you keep going with it, you can render it into nonsense because everything is, like, all words are actually acts. Like, also, like, for instance, people say, oh, you can't touch language. But you actually can. First off, you can touch words that have been written down. And also, when you speak, sounds do move through your throat, through your teeth and mouth. Physically, language is actually touchable. You can, like, I'm putting my hand in front of my mouth. There's no video here showing, it's literally just a single screen. But I'm putting my hand in front of my mouth, and as I speak, I can feel the air coming out of my mouth, which means language you can physically feel it. So you can look at it in that sense. You can say, literally, it does actually have an effect on the world, but that's not what we mean when we say that literature, that like language can't be touched. You can't physically touch it. It's mental. It's because that's not what we're talking about when we say that. So just ascribing all language to speech acts might be going too far with it, but you can argue that in an essay. And yeah, I think that's where I'm going to pretty much end things here. Hopefully it's been helpful, useful, all those kind of words. If not, I'm sorry. I don't really have anything else to say there. I'm sorry. Anyway, if it was helpful and what have you, and you enjoy this stuff I've made, or if you are appreciative that I've made them, and you would like to support me, you can read my books in the description. They're in the description, not the full books, but I mean links to where the books are. And or you can also support me on Patreon if you so desire. If not, if you don't want to, or if you can't, basically, you can also do the other things which are very helpful. The like, comment, subscribe. Those things are apparently good for Google's algorithm. So why not? And yeah, that's it, I think. Otherwise, I hope you have a great day, week, and month ahead. And, think about some speech acts and how they apply to the real world. Fun.